The fault was not in their stars. Later, after the tragedies unfolded, the astrologers would explain that there had been a terrible mistake in their calculations. The birth of an independent Myanmar almost 75 years ago on the 4th of January 1948, as well as the raising of its new six-star flag, was to take place at precisely 4:20 a.m. It had all been carefully worked out based on the astrologers' charts. The Union Jack was lowered precisely on time, and British imperial soldiers mass passed new Prime Minister Thakin Nu, later known as UNU, to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. I'm Praveen Swami, and in this edition of The Print Explorer, where we take a deep dive into how countries ended up in the conflicts they found themselves mired in, we'll be looking at the incredibly complicated story of Myanmar, which involves ethnicity, geopolitics, and outright greed and betrayal. In spite of all the careful astrological prediction you see, destiny betrayed Burma. Less than 3 months after the independence ceremony, the so-called Red Flag faction of the Communist Party of Burma, led by Thakin Than Tun, had gone underground and launched an insurgency. Karen ethnic armies threw open the gates of the notorious insane prison just outside Rangoon, which we now call Yangon. Kareni Pa'o Mujahideen seeking a Muslim state in Arakan, and even the army's own 1st Burma Rifles. All of the country seemed to be in a state of rebellion. Today, exactly the same thing seems to be happening again, at least at first glance. The new Burma, you see, was supposed to be a melting pot of ethnicities where different communities, tribes, and ethnic groups would live together in a federal state, a lot like India in a way. How did the country end up becoming a cauldron of hatred and war? A part of the answer lies in the corruption generated by the illegal trade in Burma's huge mineral wealth, including its famous rubies. Another part of the answer lies in an even more valuable resource, the opium poppy. But the most important difference between its story and that of India is how differently their democracies worked out. You'll see some strange similarities between what happened in Burma with its assassination and skullduggery and its military with what happened to India's west in Pakistan. But watch out for those. Ever since November, a savage new campaign has broken out in Burma, led by the so-called Three Brotherhood Alliance, a coalition of ethnic militia, notably the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, and the Arakan Army. Together, these groups have launched what's called Operation 1027, which has succeeded in pushing the army out of an estimated 300 outposts and bases. A separate operation, codenamed 1111, has seen army bases collapse across the Kareni state. The fighting has lapped up on India's borders. It's hard to know the exact status of contested areas since international media is not allowed to report on events from the ground. But rebels captured, at least for some time, we know, held Kaolin and Kampat right on the border with India. The Arakan army is also reported to have taken Trauning and Honebu in Chin state along the frontier with Bangladesh. Key trade outposts on the Asian Highway 1, through which much of Burma's trade with Thailand is conducted, have also been either captured by insurgents or are being fought over between insurgents and the army. Laukaing Township, the capital of the Kokang self-administered zone in the northern part of Shan state, is a key trading post for China-Burma trade, and it has also fallen. So you can see the army is getting hemmed in. Fighting has extended all the way to the borders with Mizoram, where Kuki National Army insurgents have seized a military outpost in northern Tamu on 11 December. Tamu residents reported that multiple airstrikes were carried out in defense of the base before besieged soldiers eventually gave up and fled into the jungles. Fleeing troops and fleeing insurgents have both taken shelter across the border in India, and ethnic ties between Kuki and Mizo communities on both sides pose a threat that the conflict could spill over across the border. Two of the groups involved in the fighting, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army and the Tang National Liberation Army, seem to have got much of their firepower and their resources from China. It's not very clear if this is Chinese government support or bought off the black market. The Arakan army, fighting alongside the borders with Bangladesh and India, also has close links with China, but it's unclear where its logistical resources and weapons come from just because of the distances involved. So let's take a look at how this sophisticated armed resistance came about in the first place. Large numbers of Indians, of course, wonder how things might have gone in India if it had seized independence through armed struggle rather than a democratic movement. The story of Burma provides a mirror to reflect on the issue. Burma was colonized very soon after India in 1885, after the last in a series of 3 wars between its monarchs and the British. Ethnic Burman resistance, though, didn't quite end even with British military victory. Even as political leaders mobilized for representation in the early 20th century, many also set up local armed militia, which were called Tat. Among the fallouts of the anti-imperialist movement in Burma was bitterness between indigenous people and immigrant workers from India. In 1930, 2 years after elections to Burma's assembly, there were Burmese Indian riots in which 300 Indian labourers were killed. This led on to a peasant insurgency against the British, led by Saya San. Saya San was caught, executed, and hundreds died in the fighting, which forced Britain to concede greater self-rule in 1935. Things came to a head in 1942 when Imperial Japan invaded British Burma. The Burmese Independence Army, led by the legendary General Aung San, fought alongside the Japanese, much like India's own Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Everyone in Burma, though, wasn't on General Aung's side. Karen, Kachin, and Chin battalions, who hoped for autonomy, fought on the British side against the ethnic Burman majority BIA. The insurgency crippled Japan and eventually helped the British recapture Burma in 1945. Learning from events, the BIA defected to the British side on the very eve of Japan's defeat. Following the recapture of Yangon, then Rangoon, Aung appeared at the victory parade in Rangoon wearing the uniform of a Japanese major general, historian Hugh Tinker has written. Can you imagine that? Like the Indian National Army, the BNA had been called the traitor army by the British Army, but Britain felt compelled to hand over power in Burma, knowing it could not sustain an insurgency there even as its military continued to move eastward to wipe out the Japanese altogether. So they needed a deal and they tried to make it. In 1947, the various ethnicities signed a deal called the Panglong Agreement, which envisaged a Burmese union with significant autonomy for all the different ethnic communities. At one of the meetings before the Panglong Agreement was signed, Aung San promised the hill tribes, if Burma gets 1 kyat, their currency, if Burma gets 1 kyat, then you will get 1 kyat. This was understood to be a symbolic acceptance of parity between these tribal confederal units and the center. Then things began to unravel. Even as Burma prepared for independence, two military jeeps raced through the streets of Rangoon, bursting into a cabinet meeting where the country's political leadership was considering action to disarm one of the Burman militia. The soldiers assassinated Aung San, the independence era patriarch, and father, of course, to Nobel laureate and political leader Aung San Suu Kyi, and 9 others. The country's prime minister under Japanese occupation, U Sao, was tried and executed for ordering the killing, lawyer Maung Maung has written. Even though U Nu was appointed prime minister of the new country and unleashed a successful counter-insurgency campaign against these militia, fate was pointing Burma in the direction of tragedy. Following the victory of China's People's Liberation Army in 1949, what we today call the Communist Revolution, soldiers of the defeated Kuomintang or KMT, that is the soldiers of the defeated nationalist regime, found themselves cut off in the southern province of Yunnan. The KMT soldiers retreated south across the border into Burma. Eager to harass China's communists, the American Central Intelligence Agency paid for and equipped these KMT remnants, historian Clinton Clymer records. CIA-operated cargo aircraft flew in weapons to KMT forces strung along the Salaween River, all the way down to the Tenasserim coast. The scholar Bertil Lintner explains that KMT commanders tied up with ethnic militia seeking independence, like the Karens, the Karanis, and the Mons. The KMT also built an opium empire to fund their proto-state, taxing local opium farmers and shipping refined heroin to Thailand. This drug-funded insurgency didn't do much damage to the new communist regime in China, but it sure ended up tearing up Myanmar. In less than a decade, Myanmar's opium production of 30 tons or so, mostly dealing with traditional consumers, expanded to several hundred tons, serving the entire world. Emboldened by its frontline role in the new fragile country, the Burmese military also consolidated its authority. Like in Pakistan, it came to dominate key sectors of the economy. It bought up the Burma five-star shipping line, the key freight company, a bank, and suppliers of high-quality imported goods. The generals thus acquired an economic power base independent of the political leadership. Pakistan experienced its first military coup in 1958. The generals would take over Myanmar just 4 years later in 1962. Late one night in 1962, soon after he left an opera performance in Yangon, General Ne Win began to paint Myanmar, the land of jade and rubies, in dull grey. Horse races, beauty contests, and dance competitions were all banned by the new military dispensation, author Bertil Lintner has recorded. The beer now came from the people's brewery, cakes from the people's patisseries, and toothpaste even from the people's toilet industry. The students who protested were simply brutally massacred. The main challenge to the military regime, now wearing socialist colors, came from the Communist Party of Burma. The generals responded by turning to the warlords in the Kokang region, dominated by Mandarin-speaking ethnic Han peoples, in a bid to control the flow of weapons and personnel to the Communist Party. Kokang warlords, in return for this favor to the regime, were allowed to feed the world's growing demand for heroin. Many of the warlords were colorful figures who'd make for a great movie if someone got down to scripting one. One example, the cross-dressing bisexual General Olive Yang, who had once terrified classmates by carrying guns into Lashio's Garden Angel Convent School and thrown a urine pot at the husband her parents had attempted to arrange for her when he tried to forcibly consummate their marriage. For all the grumbling, though, the 10,000 soldiers in her ranks proved willing to follow her to the gates of hell, fighting savage battles to set up and secure opium trade lines linking laboratories that made opium into refined heroin and then trafficked it to Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, and beyond. Even though the Kokang cartels controlled territory, they enjoyed a comfortable relationship with the military state. Olive Yang's brother Jimmy Yang became a member of parliament. Similarly, Lo Sing Han received permission to run opium convoys without military interference in return for providing troops to fight the communist insurgents. His brother Lo Sing Ko was conveniently appointed chief of the Kokang police. From time to time, the system frayed and the warlords found themselves fighting the army. In the mid-1970s, Peng Jiasheng allied with the Communist Party of Burma to beat out competitors in the drug trade. In the 1980s, though, when the party got split, its remnants signed a ceasefire deal with the government. Peng then signed a deal as well. But conflicts with the army for territory and shares of the drug revenue forced him into the border into Yunnan. There were others to pick up the slack though. The Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army of Peng Jiafu, the National Democratic Alliance Army led by Peng's son-in-law Lin Mingxian, and the United Wa State Army led by Bao Yuxiang. All of these were basically warlord militias run by various kinds of ethnic entrepreneurs. The drug lords enjoyed real respect in society. Last year, thousands lined up on an athletics track in Mongla in the Kokang region for the 3-day funeral rites of the 91-year-old international warlord and gun runner, narcotics trafficker and money launderer Peng Jiasheng. Friends as well as enemies came to pay homage. It was hard to tell who was a friend and who was an enemy. Representatives of the Arakan Army, the Shan State Army, the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force, the Tang National Liberation Army, and the Kachin Independence Army were all there, and so were the government wearing full military uniform. The corruption and brutality of the generals, though, led to inevitable resistance. In 1998, large-scale pro-democracy protests broke out across the country led by students. The military butchered the protesters, leading many to take shelter in India. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's government decided to support the democracy movement. New Delhi ended up paying a heavy price for severing links with Myanmar's military though, since the democracy movement did not succeed and the junta responded by giving open shelter to anti-India groups operating in the northeast. Later though, India repaired its relations with the junta. In 1995, the Indian Army targeted a column that was taking arms from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh through the Mizoram forests. The Army's 57 Division, working together with the Myanmar Army, killed 38 insurgents. Elections were held in 1990, but were annulled after voters supported politicians the generals didn't like. Even though countries eventually made their peace with the military junta, long years of international isolation and sanctions had their impact. Leading opposition figures and Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi was released in 2002 and elections were held 5 years later. Though Aung was debarred from becoming president by the military, her party now came to power. In 2010, India and Myanmar signed an agreement stating that Indian forces could pursue insurgents across the border. 4 years later, the two countries signed another agreement on coordinated patrolling and intelligence sharing. Naga and Manipuri insurgent bases across the border were shut down or at least tamped down significantly. In return, India provided economic and military aid to Myanmar, aid the generals desperately wanted to avoid the trap of total dependence on China. The brief democratic honeymoon didn't last, however. The military never relinquished its chokehold on power and the economy. The elections of 2020 taught the military that Aung was still more popular than their proxies. In response, the army staged a fresh coup that year. Ever since 2020 then, Myanmar has been locked in a bloody stalemate, in a dilemma. Helping ethnic insurgents will fuel instability on India's borders and open the gates for unchallenged Chinese influence in Burma. As things stand though, China is expanding its power with both important insurgent groups as well as the army. Insurgent formations like the Arakan army have pledged to protect Chinese infrastructure projects. Indian infrastructure works, meanwhile, are stalled because of extortion and threats. From the gargantuan Mongtang Dam on the Salavin River in Shan, to oil pipelines from southern China to the Kak Fu deep sea port in Rakhine, to new rail routes, Chinese influence is everywhere in Burma. Experts think the ongoing offensive by China-backed insurgents isn't really meant to restore democracy, just teach the generals a lesson. The failure of the junta to act against cybercrime and gambling cartels operating from Myanmar, many targeting Chinese consumers, angered Beijing. The hypothesis is that China green-lighted the insurgent offensive, but will probably rein it in short of bringing down the insurgents themselves. True or otherwise, Burma is marching onwards towards complete anarchy.